Every day begins with a choice. Before the noise of the world reaches our ears, before responsibilities pull at our attention, before worries try to settle in our hearts, we decide who gets our first moments. Meeting with God first is not a religious routine. It is a spiritual alignment. It is the act of placing our lives back into the hands of the one who gives us breath, direction, and purpose. When we meet with God first, we are not just starting the day, we are surrendering the day. Morning prayer is an invitation to step into God's presence before stepping into the demands of life. It is saying, Lord, before I speak to people, before I check messages, before I chase tasks, I choose to hear your voice. In those quiet moments, God does not rush us. He meets us with peace, clarity, and guidance. He reminds us that we do not walk into the day alone, and that nothing ahead of us is a surprise to Him. Prioritizing God before everything else begins with an intentional decision made the moment we wake up. Before the mind starts racing with responsibilities, before the heart feels the weight of expectations, choosing God first is an act of faith that shapes the entire day. It is acknowledging that life is not sustained by our effort alone, but by the grace and presence of God. When God is placed first, everything else finds its proper place, and the soul is no longer driven by urgency, but guided by purpose. Meeting with God first is a declaration that He is the source of wisdom, strength, and peace. It is a reminder that human understanding is limited, but God's understanding is complete. In prayer, we realign our hearts with His will, allowing Him to cleanse our thoughts from anxiety, pride, and fear. This moment of alignment is not about asking for things immediately, but about being still enough to recognize who God is and who we are in relation to Him. Prioritizing God before everything else requires discipline in a world that constantly competes for attention. Notifications, schedules, and obligations demand immediate response, yet none of them can give the peace that comes from God's presence. Choosing prayer over distraction in the morning is choosing eternal value over temporary urgency. It teaches the heart to seek God's approval before seeking the world's validation. When God is first, decisions are no longer driven by impulse, but by discernment. Morning prayer becomes a compass that directs thoughts, words, and actions. It brings clarity where confusion once lived and calm where chaos tried to dominate. By placing God first, we invite Him to shape our attitudes before situations test them. We allow Him to prepare our hearts for both blessings and challenges. Prioritizing God also transforms how we view time. Instead of feeling rushed and overwhelmed, time becomes a gift entrusted to us. Prayer teaches patience and reminds us that God operates beyond human schedules. When we start the day with Him, we learn to move at a pace that allows obedience rather than exhaustion. We stop measuring the day by productivity alone and begin to measure it by faithfulness. Putting God first humbles the heart. It acknowledges that self-sufficiency is an illusion and that true strength flows from dependence on Him. In prayer, we admit our weaknesses, our need for guidance, and our inability to control outcomes. This humility does not weaken us. It strengthens us by connecting us to God's limitless power. A heart that bows before God in the morning stands firm throughout the day. Prioritizing God first also sharpens spiritual sensitivity. When we consistently meet with Him, we become more aware of His voice and promptings. We learn to recognize when He is guiding us, correcting us, or asking us to wait. This sensitivity protects us from making decisions rooted in emotion or fear. It allows us to walk with wisdom, even in unfamiliar situations. When God comes first, peace becomes the foundation of the day. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of God in the middle of them. Prayer anchors the soul so that circumstances no longer dictate emotional stability. Even when challenges arise, the heart remains steady because it has already rested in God's presence. Prioritizing God first changes our desires. What once seemed important begins to lose its grip, and what truly matters becomes clear. Prayer reshapes ambitions, aligns goals with God's will, and purifies motives. It helps us desire what honors God rather than what simply satisfies the flesh. This transformation happens quietly, but its impact is lasting. Placing God first also affects relationships. A heart that has spent time with God carries patience, grace, and compassion into interactions. Instead of reacting in anger or frustration, we respond with understanding and restraint. Prayer softens the heart and reminds us that every person we encounter is also created by God and worthy of love. Prioritizing God before everything else is an act of trust. It is believing that spending time with Him is never wasted, even when the day feels full. It is trusting that God can accomplish more through a surrendered heart than we can through endless effort. When God is first, the soul is no longer scattered but centered. This priority becomes a lifestyle rather than a ritual. It shapes mornings, influences decisions, and strengthens faith. Over time, the heart learns that nothing compares to the peace of starting the day with God, that no success is greater than obedience, and no preparation is more powerful than prayer. Surrendering your plans to God begins with recognizing that no matter how carefully life is organized, human understanding remains limited. Plans are often shaped by personal desires, past experiences, and visible circumstances, but God sees beyond the present moment into outcomes we cannot imagine. Morning prayer becomes the space where control is released and trust is established. It is where the heart says that even the best intentions must be placed in God's hands for true direction. Letting go of personal agendas is not easy, especially in a world that celebrates independence and self-determination. Surrender challenges the need to be in charge and invites humility instead. When plans are surrendered to God, the pressure to make everything work is lifted. Prayer shifts the responsibility from human effort to divine guidance, creating freedom from anxiety and fear of failure. Surrendering plans does not mean abandoning effort or discipline. It means allowing God to lead the direction of that effort. In prayer, we present our goals, tasks, and expectations, acknowledging that God has the authority to redirect, delay, or reshape them. This posture of openness allows God to protect us from paths that look promising but lead to frustration, and to guide us toward opportunities that align with His purpose. When plans are surrendered, flexibility becomes a spiritual strength. Instead of resisting interruptions, the heart learns to see them as possible divine redirections. Morning prayer prepares the mind to remain open throughout the day, understanding that God's will may unfold differently than expected. This flexibility removes the frustration that comes when things do not go as planned and replaces it with trust in God's timing. Surrender also deepens faith by teaching reliance on God rather than outcomes. Prayer reminds us that success is not measured by how closely events follow our plans, but by how faithfully we follow God's leading. When plans change, faith remains steady because it is rooted in God's character, not in circumstances. This kind of faith brings peace even in uncertainty. Letting God take control of plans reshapes priorities. In prayer, God often reveals what truly matters and what needs to be released. Some ambitions are refined, others are removed, and new ones are planted. Surrender allows God to align desires with His will, ensuring that energy is invested in what brings lasting value rather than temporary satisfaction. Surrendering plans also addresses the fear of the unknown. Many plans are driven by a desire for security and predictability. Morning prayer confronts that fear by reminding the heart that God is already present in the future. Trust grows when the soul realizes that nothing ahead is hidden from Him. This awareness brings calm, even when the path forward is unclear. When plans are placed before God, prayer becomes a conversation rather than a checklist. It is not about informing God of intentions, but inviting Him into decision-making. This relational approach deepens intimacy with God and strengthens spiritual discernment. Over time, The heart learns to consult God naturally, not only in major decisions but in everyday choices. Surrendering plans also teaches patience. God's timing rarely aligns perfectly with human expectations. Prayer helps the heart wait without frustration and hope without discouragement. Waiting becomes an act of faith rather than a season of inactivity. In surrender, the soul learns that delays are often preparation, and that God's pace is purposeful. Letting God order plans transforms how setbacks are viewed. Instead of seeing them as failures, they become lessons or redirections. Prayer provides perspective, helping the heart recognize God's hand even in closed doors. This perspective protects the soul from bitterness and disappointment and keeps faith intact during challenging seasons. Surrendering plans also brings rest. The constant need to control outcomes is exhausting. Morning prayer offers rest by transferring that burden to God. Trust replaces tension, and peace replaces striving. The heart no longer carries the weight of making everything happen and learns to move forward with confidence in God's care. When plans are surrendered daily, life becomes a partnership with God rather than a solo effort. Prayer establishes this partnership at the beginning of each day, reminding the heart that God desires to lead and provide. This daily surrender strengthens spiritual maturity and fosters a deeper reliance on God's wisdom. Surrendering plans to God is a continual practice that reshapes the heart over time. It trains the soul to value obedience over control and trust over certainty. Each morning becomes an opportunity to place the day back into God's hands, believing that His plans are higher, His ways are wiser, and His guidance is always faithful. Receiving peace and direction through morning prayer begins with creating space for God before the demands of the day take over. In the quiet of the morning, the heart is more receptive, the mind is less crowded, and the spirit is more attentive. This sacred time allows God to speak clarity into areas clouded by worry and confusion. Prayer becomes the doorway through which peace enters and direction is revealed. Morning prayer is not merely a habit but a spiritual exchange. As we bring our concerns, questions, and uncertainties before God, He offers calm assurance in return. Peace does not always arrive as instant solutions, but as a settled confidence that God is in control. This peace guards the heart against anxiety and stabilizes emotions before challenges arise. Direction flows naturally from peace. When the heart is anxious, decisions are rushed and often driven by fear. Morning prayer quiets that inner noise, making room for God's guidance. In stillness, priorities become clearer, and the path forward begins to take shape. God often directs not through dramatic signs, but through gentle impressions, scripture, and inner conviction. Receiving peace through prayer reshapes the way the day is approached. Instead of starting the day feeling behind or overwhelmed, the soul begins anchored in trust. This anchor prevents external pressures from dictating internal responses. When difficulties surface, the peace received in prayer serves as a reminder that God has already gone ahead. Morning prayer also aligns the heart with God's will, which is the true source of peace. Many anxieties stem from resisting God's direction or clinging to personal expectations. In prayer, surrender takes place, allowing God to realign desires and intentions. As alignment increases, inner conflict decreases, and peace becomes more consistent. Direction received in prayer often comes as wisdom rather than detailed instructions. God shapes the heart to recognize what is right, what is timely, and what requires patience. This wisdom influences decisions throughout the day, helping avoid unnecessary conflict and missteps. When choices are guided by prayer, confidence replaces doubt. Peace gained in the morning extends beyond personal comfort and influences interactions with others. A prayed-up heart responds with patience instead of irritation and listens with empathy instead of defensiveness. This peace becomes a testimony, reflecting God's presence in everyday life. Others may not hear the prayer, but they experience its fruit. Morning prayer also brings clarity in moments of uncertainty. Life often presents choices without obvious answers. In prayer, God provides discernment that goes beyond logic. This discernment helps distinguish between good opportunities and good or ordained ones. Direction becomes clearer when decisions are filtered through prayer rather than pressure. Receiving peace and direction through prayer strengthens faith. Each morning encounter with God builds trust in His faithfulness. As prayers are answered and guidance becomes evident, confidence in God's leading grows. This growing faith reduces fear of the unknown and fosters a deeper reliance on God's presence. Prayer in the morning prepares the heart for spiritual resistance. Challenges, temptations, and distractions are inevitable, but prayer equips the believer to face them with strength. Peace becomes a shield that protects against discouragement, and direction becomes a compass that keeps the heart aligned with God's purpose. Morning prayer also renews perspective. Problems that seemed overwhelming the night before often appear smaller in God's presence. Prayer lifts the eyes from limitations to possibilities, from weakness to divine strength. This renewed perspective helps the heart face the day with courage and hope. Receiving direction through prayer is a process of listening as much as speaking. Silence in prayer allows God's voice to be heard. In these moments, the heart learns to recognize God's guidance through peace, conviction, and scriptural truth. Over time, this listening posture deepens spiritual sensitivity. Peace received in prayer is not dependent on circumstances. It remains steady even when plans change or challenges arise. This stability is evidence of God's work within the heart. Direction continues to unfold throughout the day as decisions are made in alignment with the peace already given. Morning prayer transforms the day by shaping the inner life first. Instead of reacting to events, the heart responds with wisdom and calm. Peace becomes the foundation upon which decisions are made, and direction becomes the guiding force that keeps the soul focused on God's will. Receiving peace and direction through morning prayer is a daily invitation to trust God with the unseen and unknown. Each morning encounter strengthens the connection between the heart and God, creating a rhythm of dependence and faith. Through prayer, peace settles the soul and direction becomes clear enough to take the next faithful step. Walking in obedience throughout the day begins with a heart that has already chosen submission to God. Obedience is not a series of forced actions but a response of love and trust. When the day starts in prayer, the heart is softened and made willing to follow God's direction. Obedience flows naturally from a relationship where God is honored first and His voice is valued above all others. Obedience is often misunderstood as restriction, but in truth it is protection and guidance. God's instructions are given to lead the heart into peace, wisdom, and spiritual safety. Morning prayer prepares the soul to recognize God's boundaries not as limitations, but as expressions of His care. When the heart understands this, obedience becomes a source of freedom rather than frustration. Walking in obedience requires attentiveness. God often speaks through gentle promptings, inner conviction, and reminders of His word. Prayer sharpens spiritual awareness, so these promptings are not ignored or dismissed. Throughout the day, obedience may appear in small moments, choosing patience instead of anger, honesty instead of convenience, kindness instead of indifference. Obedience is strengthened through consistency. When a heart repeatedly responds to God's guidance, trust deepens. Each act of obedience builds confidence in God's wisdom. Morning prayer reinforces this consistency by reminding the heart of God's faithfulness and authority. It establishes a daily posture of readiness to follow wherever God leads. Walking in obedience also involves resisting distractions. The world constantly pulls attention towards self, interest, and immediate gratification. Prayer equips the heart to recognize these distractions and choose God's will instead. Obedience often requires saying no to impulses that conflict with God's direction and yes to paths that require faith. Obedience throughout the day is closely tied to humility. It acknowledges that God's ways are higher than human understanding. Prayer cultivates this humility by placing the heart before God in surrender. This humility makes it easier to accept correction and redirection without resentment or pride. Obedience is tested most in challenging moments. When circumstances are difficult or unfair, the temptation to act according to emotion increases. Morning prayer prepares the heart to respond with obedience even when it is uncomfortable. Trust in God's justice and timing empowers the soul to choose righteousness over retaliation. Walking in obedience also influences decision-making. Prayer brings clarity that helps the heart discern between personal preference and God's instruction. When choices are made in obedience, peace follows even if the outcome is uncertain. This peace is evidence of alignment with God's will. Obedience strengthens spiritual character. Each faithful response to God's guidance shapes integrity, patience, and perseverance. Over time, obedience becomes a lifestyle rather than a struggle. Morning prayer supports this growth by renewing commitment to God's authority each day. Obedience also impacts relationships. A heart guided by God's commands treats others with respect, forgiveness, and compassion. Prayer reminds the soul that obedience to God includes loving others well. This obedience builds trust and reflects God's character in everyday interactions. Walking in obedience requires courage. Following God's direction may sometimes conflict with societal expectations or personal comfort. Prayer provides the courage needed to stand firm in faith. It reassures the heart that obedience to God is always worth the cost. Obedience is sustained through dependence on God's strength. Human effort alone is insufficient to remain faithful. Morning prayer invites God's power into the day, acknowledging the need for His help. This dependence keeps obedience from becoming legalistic and maintains a posture of grace. Walking in obedience throughout the day transforms ordinary moments into acts of worship. Every decision made in alignment with God's will honors Him. Prayer frames the day as an offering, where actions reflect devotion and trust. Obedience also deepens intimacy with God. Each step taken in faith strengthens the relationship. Prayer nurtures this intimacy by creating space for communication and reflection. Over time, obedience becomes an expression of closeness rather than obligation. Walking in obedience throughout the day is a continuous journey shaped by daily surrender. Morning prayer sets the foundation, aligning the heart with God's purpose and preparing it to follow His leading. Through obedience, faith becomes active, and the presence of God is experienced in every step taken so as this day begins. Choose to meet with God first. Choose prayer over panic, faith over fear, and surrender over control. Let God order your day and watch how His presence transforms not only your morning but your entire life.